Hi, my name is Marc, and this is Spengler, Heidegger, and Hegel. And I'm going to be using this PowerPoint that I put together. Most of it was put together a few years ago. Let me hit that so the computer is doing its thing. Most of this was put together a few years ago when I was grasping with the question and the problem of the impact of technology upon where the world appears to be heading. This was 2021, right on the heels of 2020 and all of the lockdowns. So the subtitle here the title is very relevant, as well as the subtitle, to all three of our philosophers that we're dealing with. Spengler, Heidegger, and Hegel all took a profound interest in science, and they understood science in very different ways. So what I like to do specifically here is employ a dialectic form of teaching, which is right up Hegel's alley, but I think it has other arenas of application as well. And we'll get to what Hegel means by a dialectic shortly, but the simple form of what I mean by that is we're going to take some ideas that are opposite of each other in many ways and consider fundamental questions and problems from these at loggerheads perspectives. And with the dialectic proper, there would be a reabsorption of both of those opposites into a third thing, which is commonly called a synthesis. Okay, even though I don't believe Hegel used that terminology. So instead of a synthesis between Heidegger and Hegel, who are at loggerheads, I'm throwing kind of this wild card into the middle in the figure of Oswald Spengler on the bottom of the photo there. And we'll see that Spengler is basically what I consider the anti-philosopher. And this is where we get the title of this presentation here from the slide, Engineering the New Inception. Spengler, one of his famous quotes was something along the line of, "We need fewer philosophers, more engineers." The reason he believed that is because he believed that Western civilization was in a period of decline. It had exhausted almost all of its possibilities. The last were the rounding out and the refining of the scientific arts of this Cartesian worldview of subjects and objects and the manipulation of objects in creating one's world, which is not how the world has always been understood, including by philosophers as well as the other two philosophers here today. So this confrontation is a Heideggerian term, which basically means when we study readers, thinkers, ideas, we are not just absorbing ourselves with the ideas, pardon me, but we are attempting to fully confront with all the questions that we have about these ideas and all our skepticism, right? To put that out there, not to politely, I'm just going to I'm going to go with the story because otherwise I'm going to miss what it's saying. That's one approach. Heidegger's was, you got to grab it by the, wherever you're going to grab it and confront it. Hold on, now you do have to get the fullness of what it's saying, which is why a Heidegger, he read his Kant, he read his pre-Socratics, he read his Plato, his Aristotle, and all of these different figures. But once you have that handle, then Heidegger was all about this confrontation. So that's what I'm doing here between Heidegger and Hegel. The essence of their confrontation is, in Heidegger's own words, the problem of infinity and the question of infinity. For Hegel, being, which is the fundamental principle that all three of these philosophers adhere to in one way or another. It's another reason I have Spengler in here. But being is that fundamental principle, and it's something that is eternal it is the absolute. It is God. It is infinite. It's complete. It's perfect. And then Hegel addressed the question of, well, how does evil exist? Why is the natural world, the world of human beings and objects, does it seem to be inferior to these grand ideas, and why do people have problems, et cetera, imperfections? He attempted to explain that through his philosophy of nature, which we're not even really going to get into here. Perhaps just to bear a little bit later. Heidegger, on the other hand, that is part of the universal tradition of philosophy that he pins the blame on Plato from his point of view, that treats reality, the world that we live in, which is not necessarily the world of hard objects. It can be the things that we're thinking or experiencing or feeling, and all sorts of other things. But whatever our experiences are for Heidegger, they are not of this infinite, eternal world. They're fleeting, they're finite, and they might not even occur. Existence might not continue, whether for the individual or for everyone. But the human being for Heidegger is defined as that being which is aware of the possibility of the impossibility of being. In other words, its own death as a possibility for the future. So for Heidegger, human beings are future-oriented. We should be looking towards the future in a way we can't help, because this knowledge of our own, at some point, futural death, at least as a possibility, informs everything about who we are. And what do we usually do with it? According to Heidegger, we usually flee into everydayness, the world of objects and ideas and raising your family and doing your job and things like that. It's more comfortable. The ground feels more solid. But Heidegger argues that that ground is not solid at all. So we're going to have a confrontation between those two. And then with Spengler here, Spengler's contribution is kind of this conceptual lens with which to view all of these things and people and ideas, including himself, and to situate these things historically in time, which is something Heidegger was all about, but I think Spengler did a much better job of dealing with the temporal aspects in the actual world than Heidegger. But that's not to say that Heidegger's philosophy is not just as much, if not more, valuable to the natural world. So anyway, Spengler's take is that even our very notions of space and time are culturally influenced. What do I mean by that? So for Spengler, look at architecture. That's the tell. That's the first tell of how is this culture, how is this people different from that culture? Or perhaps similar, but what is their architecture like? So he looks at, and their art after that, and then art goes through different permutations over time, which we'll get to in later sciences. When you look at the architecture of, say, Russia, you see buildings that basically look like mosques. They're low buildings, kind of longish and flat, with a cupola or a dome on top, and a distinctly Muslim style of architecture. Now you could say, well, the architects were hired to come in from south of Russia, south of the Ukraine, and maybe. But where Spengler goes with this, the way that Spengler tells his story of history, is that the Russian plains are long and broad and flat, so their architecture is going to tend to replicate that. Russian relationships also tend to reproduce that long, flat plain. Everyone is greeted. Spengler is writing roughly during World War I, and then after a little bit. People are greeted as brother. Even the Tsar is seen as a brother. They're united by a religion, their form of Orthodox Christianity, and within that world feeling, even the Tsar is a brother. So now, contrast that with what develops in Western Europe and Central Europe during the Renaissance, and then leading up into modernity. Cities with giant buildings that we call them skyscrapers, and before that it was the great cathedrals. It is a soaring upward with representations within it, or connotations of rank and hierarchy, of great masses of individual effort and labor and power, inspiring awe and reaching for infinite space. And that is what Spengler calls the Faustian soul, which he cites as basically beginning around the year 1000 in Europe, with the belief that the world was coming to an end as the millennium approached. So you can imagine what kind of energies that liberated in people. Some people, it probably sapped all the energies out of them, too scared to do anything. But others, the more adventurous types, or just people who are more reflective perhaps. So his thinking goes, this belief of the impending end of the world set loose all these energies, and when it didn't happen, wow, those energies, they kept going for a full 800 years, and they finally reached their peak in the 19th century with the music of Beethoven, and at the end of the 18th century with Mozart. And then you have cabinet diplomacy and world imperialism, non-Euclidean sciences. You have the infinite, this reaching to grasp, to just expand, and the Crusades as well, into everything, to the point where we are today, where even the idea of hard coinage and even paper money has become etherealized into digits simply on some electronic device somewhere. And we were put on a fiat standard over 50 years ago by Richard Nixon. Spengler didn't know those things, but they all go to show that reaching, that quest for infinite space and dissolving of all boundaries is part of the art, the architecture, and the way of life of the Faustian, basically European soul, as opposed to the Russian soul with a more egalitarian, from the world feeling point of view. I'm not talking about the political reality here, but the political reality offers to the people, what do they offer? It offers what the people kind of naturally are longing for, this kind of communism, this leveling of a plane, right? And this equality and brotherhood ideals and things like that. Whereas different cultures offer different ideas. So with the Greeks, they were not lusting or soaring for infinite space. Everything was about bodies, solid bodies. Even their notion of space was of bodies interacting with other bodies, and they would develop their physics based upon that. Even their math and their geometry has its roots in these things, according to Spengler, which is completely at odds with our space-dissolving ideas of force and functions and mathematics and the aforementioned, some of them non-Euclidean geometries. So just to give you an idea of the difference of those cultural souls, and then for Spengler to tie this part up here, for Spengler, every culture is an organism, just like the individual has a life cycle. It's born, and its birth is synonymous with its first experience of depth. So for Spengler, the depth experience kind of comes to predominate its view of the world. So we take for Spengler the Middle Eastern peoples, which he calls the Magian, M-A-G-I-A-N, or Magian cultures, don't see themselves as we Faustian Europeans, or whatever you want to call it, we see ourselves as objects in a space that surrounds us all around, and it's like would never really think, most of us, that anyone ever thought otherwise. It's taken for granted. It's taken as a given. But for Spengler, within his story, the Magian sees themselves in this intertwining cavern. The world feeling is that of a cavern, and it's mysterious and it's dark. Certain passages are lightened, and God is kind of like that. God is the architect, and also the light through the darkness. Perhaps I'm really butchering the religious interpretation, but I'm trying to give you some idea of how Spengler saw that Middle Eastern kind of world soul. So the best way to explain it, and what Spengler does, is, well, what is the main artistic production of the Magian soul? Well, architecture, first of all, right? We already said that the Russians were building mosques. They're building mosques there in the Middle East, and have been for a long time as well. So yes, you also have that kind of communal, in the sense of tribal brotherhood for those that are believers, and Spengler goes very deeply into that, I believe, the second volume of The Decline of the West. But the prime symbol of the Magian culture for Spengler is the mosaic. Right? It's this interweaving of lines, and it's like it's the same thing over and over, yet there's this mysterious pattern, and how is light reflecting on, and like so just a very different worldview and approach to the world. The Indian world soul, for Spengler, or the subcontinent of India, is that of timelessness. I have a copy of the Upanishads, selections from the Upanishads somewhere, and whoever wrote the forward or the preface or the introduction, whatever it was, is saying, like, when people ask when were the Upanishads written, well, the answer is that's a silly question. They're the perennial wisdom. They're the eternal wisdom. They've always been around. The author is Brahma, or whatever a particular interpretation or sect might call it. But they've always been here. So the view of time is completely different. Their ideas about how to live their life are very different. And Spengler looks at the arts and the sciences and the mathematics for these different cultures to show some ingenious differences. But then, more specifically as well, where in that cycle of the birth of the culture through its depth experience, then followed by the maturation from that culture to actually refining that experience. So instead of just going and running around and killing everyone, or converting people to your religion, or doing what primitive people, suddenly struck by a frenzy of a new idea, often, perhaps not always, tend to do. Once they've kind of gotten beyond that, then there's plenty at times, right, for at least for a certain class, and that class can explore the arts and the sciences and create all these wonderful and destructive and all those different things that we associate with culture that are considered good and bad. And these are the high forms of culture that last for centuries, with all their forms of math and doing science and poetry and mating styles and all sorts of things like that. After that phase, once the great creative works, whether that creative work was a crusade, which is going around killing people, happens to be in the name of a new idea and a new reconstruction of the world, and it generates all these vast energies, or Napoleon doing a similar thing, going into Egypt. Look at all the new energies and ideas that have come from just simply the Rosetta Stone's discovery as one example. After those cultures settle down, if they don't bite off more than they can chew, which was the case with Napoleon. But if they don't do that, then they settle down and they start to build a civilization which is more stable, it's more secure, it tends to become more worldly, because then other people start wanting to come in and trade with you and vice versa. There's also that part that as the culture becomes more stable and secure and has already defended itself from its neighbors, now it can start to go and start oppressing other people to get their goods, their women, their services, or perhaps it thinks it's liberating those people as well. And then the difference may be in the eye of the beholder. But anyway, this is often how the history goes. So that is the stage of civilization, which Spengler points to. So that first stage, that birth, that depth experience, that is the springtime, okay? That is the birth of a new soul, and it's spring, and everything's birds and bees, and there's not much forethought ahead going on. And then you have the summer, which is the flowering of all that creative energy of youth in ways that are more sustainable and more likely to achieve perhaps a goal state. Again, looking at sustainability more so now, for one's family, for the state, and for the ideas that one has, things like that. And that is compared with the summer. Civilization, which follows upon that, starts to go into the imperial stage. That corresponds with the fall. The culture is getting older now. It's not creating these great new things out of nowhere anymore, but there's still lots of energy going on. It's starting to conquer other peoples, injecting foreign people and ideas into its cultural and biological polity. And then what happens after that over time, you wind up with the world city. Everyone crammed in, like millions of people, and the upper classes in particular, they stop having children because they want to enjoy their lives, and you can just hire the slaves or the migrant workers that came in from all parts of the world into your great cities and let them do all the dirty work. And this all goes back to Plato, basically, what I'm talking about right here. But so in this final state, the winter, the decline of the West, title of Spengler's 2-volume great work. In the winter of a civilization, what happens is basically all that's left is the completing of those cultural energies that were unleashed in the birth of spring, refined in summer, and then become more materialistic but practical in the fall. And now there is the just taking everything, finishing things off, basically, mopping up, if you will. And Spengler is kind of trying to take that crash of the West. He began writing in 1917, he says, during World War I. The book was published in 1926, volume 1. So Spengler wants to try to, instead of just seeing the West crash, because he knows his history, he wants to control that crash and turn it into a crash landing. And hence, engineering, not philosophy. We're out of ideas as far as new ideas for this culture. The culture that's going to succeed us, they're going to be the idea men and the brain men. But right now, we need to complete our physical, mechanical, etc. understanding of the world, simply because that's the best that we have to do with the cards that we have to play. Now, there's also the flowering elements of that new culture and civilization that are available with our entire culture, going back to the year 1000, just to arbitrarily kind of seal it off at that. But as Spengler says, the culture to follow us may or may not use these things that we bequeath them. Specifically, what he says that our Faustian culture is going to bequeath them is a hard-working, dictatorial, world-embracing kind of socialism. So, if you look at like where we're at now, and he also says that there would only be a few hundred people in the world today, 1917 to 1926. There'd only be a few hundred people in the world today that would call themselves socialists if they really knew like where socialism is heading. And Spengler foresaw this giant monolithic totalitarianism takeover of everything in the modern world, which he got to see a little bit of under the Nazis. He died in 1936, but today, obviously, he would have simply, recognized what he was saying was happening all along, and would not necessarily have seen it as a good thing or a bad thing, but perhaps might have tried to steer that crash landing by having a study of all these different cultures and seeing where they are, and therefore being able to pinpoint and say, aha, I bet that this is the new culture coming up. Why? Because it's vibrant, it's full of energy, and it has a vision of where to go next. So when we start looking around as, whoa, what does the future hold? That's when we come to science and a very different vision that is not necessarily human-oriented in its essence, and that's where we will get to for